We have arrived at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. So to refresh our memory, knowing that we were coming up onto the Gospel of the year of Matthew, we know that the church has a 3-year cycle, year A, year B, and year C. We're back to year A, which is the year of Matthew. And so to prepare ourselves, we've been reading the entire Gospel of Matthew from start to finish. And so last class that we were together, we got through Matthew chapter 25. We loved that parable of the sheep and the goats. We started part of chapter 26, which means that we are picking up chapter 26, verse 31 of the Gospel of Matthew through the end, and it's only 28 chapters, so we're finishing this evening our study of the Gospel of Matthew. Deacon Stephen, do you want to lead us up with Jesus predicting Peter's denial? This is Matthew chapter 26, verses 31 through 35.
Then Jesus told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same.
We've heard this story before. Matthew is setting it up, right? They're all saying, "We're going to stick to you to your death, Jesus. Even if they were to come after you, we're going to be standing by you and protecting you and making sure they don't." Yeah, we all know how that goes. Jesus says, we have Jesus after the fact, right? This gospel is being written in the 8th century AD, some 40, 50 years after Jesus' death, where Jesus is prophesying, all of you will fall away. Peter says, "I never will." And of course, we know where this is going. Jordan, do you want to read Gethsemane? This is verses 36 through 46 of chapter 26.
Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't 2 men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer."
We've all heard this story. We hear this story every year as part of our Passion narrative. First, the Peter and the sons of Zebedee. Who are the sons of Zebedee? We find them in the gospel on this coming Sunday. The sons of Zebedee are James and John. So Peter, James, and John are invited into the garden. We get this image that Jesus took along all his friends, had them all come to a certain place, took Peter, James, and John a little closer, and then Jesus went off and prayed beyond that. Said, "Hey guys, just stay here, keep watch with me." And what happens? They keep falling asleep. Jesus prays, "My Father, take this cup away from me." What cup? Was Jesus holding a cup? So for the ancients, the imagery was of the cup of suffering. You know, sometimes God gives us, I hesitate to use these words, but for the ancients, they thought that God is the cause of these things, right? God gives some people a cup of suffering. Some people drink wine and are joyful. Others are given a cup of suffering and drink suffering. But Jesus is at the point of death, so it's almost like the image that brings to mind for me is, do you remember stories of Socrates, a Greek philosopher? How did he die? They made him drink poison. So it's almost like, imagine being handed a cup of poison. Jesus, at this moment, knows he's going to die the next day. "Father, if it's possible, take this cup away from me." Goes back and forth with his friend various times. and finds them asleep, which is why we love this line. Father Roy recently used this line during the Masses, right, about how it is that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Isn't that true of all of us? We find ourselves with a human body, which needs rest, which needs food, which has various needs. And sometimes we'd love to do certain things, but our bodies just don't allow it. Which is why this quote from Matthew chapter 26 is so useful in our daily lives. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Why did you oversleep? I'll tell you. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. You ate that whole bag of potato chips? Yeah, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
But that means at the end, you die. So we want to keep on living.
Keep on living. Jesus arrested. Becky, this is chapter 26, verses 47 through 56. Jesus arrested.
While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Then the man stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scripture be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat at the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled.
Yikes, just as we imagined, right? You will all fall away from me. All the disciples fled. Before they fled, who was his betrayer? One of the 12, one of his closest friends, one of the 12, was the one who would betray him. How interesting it becomes with saying, "Oh, Rabbi," a title of honor and respect, in a moment where he is betraying his friend. He gives him a kiss, a sign of love and affection, in a moment when he is betraying him. Jesus is arrested. We have an incident with the sword actually cutting off the ear of the servant of the high priest in this story. It doesn't say anything about the servant being healed in other stories. It talks about how it gives the servant a name and says how it was that his ear was healed. Jesus talks about, why are you coming after me with clubs and swords? Am I like some sort of threat to y'all? Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. You know where the story's going. Terry Ann, that brings us up to 57 through 68. Jesus before the Sanhedrin or the Sanhedrin. We'll take Vincent's question before we jump in. Vincent?
Sorry about that. The question is, how can I word this? How is the significance of Judas betraying Jesus? I know it was written in the Gospels and the prophets and everything, but didn't they already know who he was, who Jesus was, instead of going up to the one I kissed is the one that you arrest? What?
Good question. So this was an age before cameras and everything else, so we wouldn't assume that they would just know. No, we're going into the garden, but he's going to point Jesus out to us. But Judas does get a bad rap in history. What I think one thing that you're pointing to, Vincent, is the fact that Judas, if all of this is foretold in Scripture, if Jesus even knew this one was going to betray him, one of his friends was going to betray him, it's sort of like all of this has to happen because that's just the way that it is. Judas cannot not betray Jesus. Judas, I like the take that many scripture scholars like to look at the story and sort of give a twist on it, that Judas was trying to help his friend out. Think about this for a moment. If the Messiah was like a military messiah, then let's set Jesus up. Let's put him in a situation where he can show everyone who he is. And so I'm going to take out these people to arrest him so that he can just show us his power in that moment of showing that he's the Messiah. He's shown all these other miracles. Surely when they come out to him to arrest him, he's going to do a magnificent display. I'm going to help Jesus out and set him up like that. Okay, maybe not. There are various perspectives. Follow me? Was Judas, because Judas is painted as an evil person. The Satan entered into Judas. Judas is painted as an evil person. Satan entered into Judas, and he did what he did for that reason. Becky?
When did Satan enter Judah? Just because of what he did?
Okay. Yeah, actually, we don't have that in this story. We have 4 different stories: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In one story, it was that Satan, at the moment Satan entered him, and he did what he did.
Oh, okay.
So that would be pulling from another story. I apologize for confusion.
No. I just didn't remember that. I was like,
Yikes.
missed.
Yeah, poor Judas.
Why Judas though? Why didn't he get one of the other ones?
Excellent question. Could have just easily been one of the others. Jesus before the Sanhedrin. This is chapter 26, 57 to 68. Carry on.
Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, "This fellow said, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?"
Who's doing all this at this point? Is it Pilate and the Roman soldiers? It's the religious leaders of his day. Jesus is being taken before the high priests and the Sanhedrin, or the Sanhedrin, whichever you prefer. Jesus is being taken before them, arrested, and is accused of blasphemy. He's blaspheming. What does it mean to blaspheme in this instance? He is taking God's attributes for himself. He's claiming to be God. He can take this. We can tear down the temple and he'll rebuild it in 3 days. Only God could do something. There is no person on this earth who could rebuild the temple in 3 days. Then Jesus talks about being the Son of Man, the Son of God, sitting at the hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. You are telling us that you are that Son of Man, the Son of God, the one who's coming? Blasphemy. Tore his cloak, and that's when they start to get physical with Jesus. They start mistreating him. That takes us to Peter disowns Jesus, verses 69 through 75. Janie?
Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. But he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath, "I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away. Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly.
So we get this picture of Jesus is inside being mistreated by the high priest, false witnesses, while Peter is outside in the garden. We've heard this story before. Peter denies Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. I like that last line though. Your accent gives you away. Right? It's almost as if they in Jerusalem could hear by his northern dialect and or accent how it was that no, you're one of his friends, aren't you? Your accent gives you away. Father Mike Ellis, in a recent issue of our magazine, Extraordinary Catholics magazine, pointed to that sentence and said, what a beautiful thing. Wouldn't it be something if we all had a Jesus accent, if you will, if when people heard us, they were like, oh, you're you're part of Jesus's church, right? I can tell by the way that you talk that you're a Catholic.
Oh.
Wouldn't that be cool? For people to know us by our accent.
Father Jamie, the guide over there in Rome told us that Peter was crucified with the head down. Is it true, or is it?
I wasn't there, but that's certainly a tradition of the church, is that Peter, on the moment that he died, the story is told, he said, no, don't crucify me like you crucified Jesus. I'm not worthy of that. They crucified him upside down. That's
Eventually, he was crucified too.
Yikes. Denied Jesus, went outside and wept bitterly. We're ready for chapter 27, the second last chapter. This brings us up to Gloria. Judas hangs himself. Chapter 27, verses 1 through 10.
Early in the morning, all the chief priests and elders of the people made their plan how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that of us? What is that to us? They replied. That is your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priest picked up the coins and said, it is against the law to put this into the treasury, since this is blood money. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it was been called the field of blood to this day. Then what spoken by Jeremiah the prophet and fulfilled, they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me.
Wow, so the religious leaders are the ones who arrested Jesus and started abusing Jesus, but they don't want blood on their hands, right? Oh, they're too holy for that. They take them to the governor, the civil governor, Pontius Pilate, asking that Pilate take care of business. Judas decides to return the silver. I love that line, I have sinned. We have this picture of a repentant Judas in this gospel. So just imagine for a moment that you are God sitting in heaven having to judge Judas. Which way are you sending him? Are you sending him with the sheep or with the goats? Are you sending him to heaven or to hell? Boy, he's sorry. He recognizes that he did something wrong, and it seems that he's sorry. And also, we have this story of his just to call it what it is, of Judas's suicide. He kills himself. He hangs himself. Why does a person ever commit suicide? Because they find themselves in a situation without hope. They can't see the future. Judas found himself in that situation. And of course, Matthew brings it back to a prophecy. During Matthew's entire gospel, it's all about prophecies being fulfilled. And one of those prophecies was about how it was that the Messiah was going to be betrayed for money, for 30 pieces of silver. Huh, how much did Judas get? 30 pieces of silver.
So then that just points to the fact that Judas did in fact do it to betray Jesus and not to make him show his messiahness.
He certainly got paid for it. It may not have been all goodwill.
Is the field of blood an actual thing or just for the story?
Field of blood was an actual thing at that time. I mean, it's essentially, they're describing how it was that the field of blood got its name. So when Grandpa Rudy told his stories around the campfire and they asked, why is it called the field of blood? Grandpa Rudy had a story for that. Oh, you haven't heard it? Let me tell you, grandkids, this is why we call it the field of blood.
I didn't hear that.
It was
I've never heard that.
Bought with blood money.
Yeah, never heard of that. Wow.
Did he actually hang himself?
Did he actually hang himself? According to this story, he hung himself.
Well, it'll come later.
Yeah. Actually, it was in this story. He went away and hanged himself. That's all it says.
So we don't know if he's in heaven or not.
I don't know if he's in heaven or not. It seems he was sorry. But he's also painted as having done something pretty serious. Something so serious that caused him to hang himself, to take his own life. Chapter 27, verses 11 through 26. Vincent, Jesus before Pilate. It's a long section. If you want to take half of it or all of it, we'll let you decide, Vincent.
Okay. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony that you are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even a single charge, to get to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which one do you want to release to you? Jesus, Barabbas, or Jesus who was called the Messiah?" For he knew it was well out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas or to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with the Jew who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting to take water and wash his hands from the crowd, in front of the crowd, "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." All the people answered, "His blood is on us and our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him to be crucified.
Yikes. So Jesus is brought before Pilate, who asks him, the accusation that the priests are saying is that you are the king of the Jews. Why would this be serious? Because there is only one king, and that is Caesar. Caesar is the king. Jesus could not claim to be king. Follow me? So, in this story, Matthew paints Jesus as being silent in front of Pilate, and Pilate is astounded, amazed, according to the story, that Jesus isn't like saying anything to defend himself. Don't you have anything to say for yourself? It's his custom on Passover, according to the story, to release one prisoner. So he asks, do you want me to release to you Jesus Barabbas? Did you see that? Did you catch that in the story?
So I was
Jesus.
confused. Is his name Jesus Barabbas?
So we know that Jesus' name was not Jesus. Jesus is the English translation. In his language, it would have been something more similar to Yeshua, or Yeshua, however we might spell it in English. Yeshua was the Hebrew name for Joshua. Do you remember who Joshua was? Moses didn't go into the promised land. Moses died. It was Joshua who led them into Moses' land. So it was a very popular Jewish name to name your child Joshua. Josh. Jesus was really Josh. But I'm not joshing. So in this case, this popular name, Joshua, Yeshua, was also this guy's first name. This is in an era when we didn't have last names. It wasn't Jesus Rodriguez or Jesus Rosales or Jesus, no. It was, you would refer to the person by their father's name, the son of so-and-so. So in this case, it was Yeshua Bar Yosef, simply meaning this is Jesus who's Joseph's son of Joseph. Here, do you want me to release to you Joshua, the son of Abbas? Or here in this place, we might say Joshua or Jesus, the son of Joseph, but by this time Joseph is long gone from the scene. How does Pilate refer to him? Do you want me to release to you Jesus, the son of Abbas, or Jesus, the Messiah? And what I love about this dynamic, many years ago at a former parish, we had a course on community organizing. And I always loved using this story as an example because Pilate found himself with his hands tied because he could not kill Jesus. The crowd was so worked up, the high priests, the religious leaders had so worked up the crowd saying, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. What are you going to do when the entire crowd is screaming for something? When I was in elected office, it was a challenge because, you know, your heart tells you one thing is right, and yet you have people screaming at you and organizing to pressure you to do something else. It's one thing I don't miss about that part of it.
So Pontius Pilate was kind of like a governor, and then the king was Caesar?
The emperor, yeah, the king, the king, if you will. The emperor was Caesar, and Pilate was essentially his governor in that territory.
So how come, so really it was Caesar who was in charge, correct?
Caesar was in charge.
So how come Pontius Pilate has really gotten like the blame for at least for me forever, just because every week in church we say the creed, and in the creed it states Pontius suffered, died under Pontius Pilate. How come we don't say he did that under Caesar? Why is it under Pontius
Excellent
Pilate?
question. I mean, the blame goes toward Pilate in this, even though he's the one who washed his hand. Poor guy. He's the one who's like, I'm not going to have any part of this. I'm not going to take responsibility for this. And every Sunday we peg him. Instead of Caiaphas, the high priest.
Or even the
It seems
people,
that
the
evil
crowd.
was happening over here. This guy, that's why I like the wife's dream too. Pilate's wife comes to him and says, no, don't be doing anything to that guy. I had a dream.
Well, even like the crowd, like, I don't know, the crowd doesn't get the credit that they should get for being the ones to really
There you go. Or the blame.
go for it.
That's right. Blame that crowd. Blame those religious leaders and blame that crowd. Dude. Think of all the analogies that could be made today between various religious leaders who whip people into frenzies believing certain things, and then they go out and do those things.
I'm surprised that because God, we had that Noah's Ark where he flooded all those bad people.
Yeah.
Why didn't God do the same thing for his son? is
Amen.
kill all those people who told him to be crucified,
Yeah.
or those elders or the priest, high priest,
Yeah.
to be punished for putting his son to death.
All this stuff was
Right.
supposed to happen, all right?
That's part of it. So
To
part of it
fulfill.
was for them, they were believing that all this was fulfilling a prophecy. And also they were living in a very evil world where many of them had already, where they were being persecuted. So they could point to a story of other people who were persecuted and essentially say, you know what, this evil that's in our world is nothing new. Evil took Jesus' life, but the story doesn't end there. And so even if evil people come after you, got good news for you. What happened to Jesus is going to happen to you. Evil, it's this age-old problem of evil, right? What do you do with the evil in the world? And essentially Matthew and others are saying that evil existed in the time of Jesus. They put Jesus to death, but that's not the end of the story. People are going to do the darndest things on this planet. And yet, we believe that God is going to work for the best.
So I've always seen the Jewish community as being like outsiders. Nobody, quote unquote, liked them. And it seems to me that it stems all the way back to there. Because they're the ones that killed Jesus.
Yeah. And Matthew is a big reason why there is in our world what we refer to as anti-Semitism. What is anti-Semitism but being against Jewish people and the Jewish religion? And remember, human beings have this thing where it's us and them, where the Jews become the them, and people like Matthew, with the holy holies of the Christian church, are essentially blaming them. And throughout history, we've continued to blame them, and think of what that's resulted in. 6 million Jews being killed during World War II. That was during the lifetime of some of us and or of our parents and grandparents. 6 million people, Jews. How does one justify that? It goes back to texts like this, where it's putting the blame on Jewish people for crucifying Jesus.
Hitler was Catholic?
Adolf Hitler was a Roman Catholic.
So is that
Also
why he
served-
was killing all these Jews, because he blamed them?
Well, he didn't blame them for Jesus' death. He wasn't using that religious reason.
Oh.
His reason, the reason that he forwarded was, let's create a pure, or in his words, an Aryan race. Anyone who's not pure needs to go. Yikes. So all of that, it would be nice to be able to say that all of this is in the past, except that during recent years we've seen this rearing its ugly head in anti-Semitism. Jews will not replace us. And all these other things that these militant Christian nationalists are spewing. It is heavy. The soldiers mocked Jesus. Mario, this is verses 27 through 31. We're in Matthew chapter 27, 27 to 31.
Okay. The soldiers mocked Jesus. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff on his right hand. Then they kneeled in front of him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him.
Some real bullies in this scene. The soldiers stripping Jesus of his clothes, putting scarlet on him. Scarlet was not an easy color to come by for those who dyed cloth back in that time. Scarlet, violet. You know, was difficult, a difficult color to create. And so it was typically reserved for royalty. And so they are mocking him by putting on scarlet and by giving him a crown. I put crown in quotation marks because what are they creating this crown of? Gold? Thorns. They put a stick in his hand to symbolize a scepter, what a king holds and what a ruler holds in her or his or their hand to symbolize their dominion, their rule over other people. So they're just mocking Jesus before leading him away to kill him. Deacon Stephen, we're to the crucifixion of Jesus, Matthew chapter 27, verses 32 through 44.
As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink, mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots, and sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head they placed the written charge against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him dead. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him.
I like Gloria's question before. In the day of Noah, God descended in the flood and took care of business. Right? You think that in this situation, God's going to step in and do something, right? God's going to come in and strike down these people who do something. But this, we find Simon helping to carry the cross. Where do we find that? During the Stations of the Cross. We find that scene of Simon helping to carry the cross. Taking the place of Golgotha, which means the skull. Offering him gall, wine with gall, which would be like a way to be able to dull the pain. What do you call it? Like a painkiller? Can we give you a painkiller? They cast lots for his clothes. I-N-R-I. Why did I put I-N-R-I up here? Did you ever see above any crucifix the letters I-N-R-I, INRI? What does that stand for? It's an abbreviation for, remember in Latin there is no J. The J is an I, so it's an abbreviation for Jesus of Nazareth,
King of
the
the
King
Jews.
of the Jews. Re, or Rex in Latin, Theodorum. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That's what they put above the crucifix in this story by Matthew, so that people would know what his crime was. He claimed to be the King of the Jews. 2 thieves are crucified with him. Do you remember the story that we had last year when we read the Gospel of Luke of how one of them said, "Jesus, remember when you come to the kingdom"? One was insulting Jesus, "Save us!" The other one says, "Jesus, remember when you come into your kingdom." We don't find that in Matthew. Matthew just tells us 2 thieves were crucified with him. And then the people jeered at him. "If you're the Messiah, save yourself. Come down on that cross." Messiah?
So if Jesus would have saved himself in that instant and wouldn't have been resurrected, would he wouldn't have been the Messiah then, right? If he did that, that's why he had to make sure he didn't.
Excellent question. I mean, if we're talking about the fulfillment of prophecies, how does it allow this is happening in order that prophecies might be fulfilled? Then it was prophesied that the Messiah would suffer. That brings us to the to the death of Jesus. Matthew chapter 27, verses 45 through 56, the death of Jesus. Jordan?
From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He's calling Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Many women there, watching from a distance, they had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons.
So this is as close as we get in the scriptures to the zombie apocalypse. You gotta love this story. Matthew tells us a story that we don't hear in any of the other three gospels. And that is that once Jesus gave up his spirit, Jesus is hanging on the cross from 12 to 3. Let's just back up and acknowledge Jesus suffered for 3 hours on that cross, according to the story. 3 hours on the cross. 3, of course, is a symbolic number. But just imagine hanging on the cross for 3 hours with nails through your wrists. Ouch. And hanging by those nails in your wrists while your body is struggling to get oxygen into it. Essentially, Jesus died because he couldn't get enough oxygen into his body because the weight of his body was pulling on those nails in his arms. He couldn't, and his feet were nailed to the cross. There's no way that he could lift himself up to be able to get a breath. Follow me? No way that you could pick yourself up to be able to get air into your lungs. His last words in the Gospel of Matthew are, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you abandoned me? Psalm 22, last words in the Gospel of Matthew that we hear from Jesus before his death. Not very hopeful words. Why have you abandoned me? Here I am, dying. Same words that we heard him utter in the Gospel of Mark as well. He gave up his spirit, he died, and then the zombie apocalypse began. The tombs were open, people arose and went into the town. Big earthquake, all sorts of signs marking that something was happening here. Matthew's the only one who talks to us about the zombie apocalypse.
Is there a difference in Eli and Eloi? I thought that's what it was.
Eloi, lama sabachthani, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Eli, it's the same root, which is why in the ancient languages that they were speaking, the people weren't understanding what was he trying to say. Was he like waiting for Eli or Eloi or someone of that name? Elijah, Elias? Is he like calling out to them? Hoping that they'll like come rescue him? Is he expecting them to appear?
It's a sad story, but I like that story, the ending. And the reason why, because to me, it makes it humanly God. Yeah. At first, they were saying you're the Messiah, you're the King, you're the thing, but at the end, he was actually a human being. But then God said, no, he's my son. And then that's when everything else happened, to prove that it was his son.
So I think that's one of the things that gives us hope, is that Jesus was one like us in all things but sin. And if God could do that for one of us, Jesus, then God can do that for any of us. A story of God becoming flesh, and of that God made flesh, Emmanuel, Jesus, suffering, dying, but that's not the end of the story. As we're about to see the burial of Jesus, Becky, this is Matthew chapter 27, verses 57 through 61.
As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb.
So how beautiful. Jesus came into this world with one guy named Joseph looking over him, his stepfather. Jesus, after he was died, had another Joseph of Arimathea, who took care of him after his death. Joseph was a popular Jewish name. Can you think of any of the Josephs in the Bible? Who would they have been named after? Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Joseph in the book of Genesis was the one who went down into Egypt and was the story of how it is that the Israelites ended up in Egypt and had to come out of Egypt. So that Joseph was the patron of Jesus' stepdad, Joseph, and also Joseph of Arimathea, who took care of him after he died. Took his body down from the cross, put it into the tomb. End of the story? Not yet. Carry on the guard at the tomb. This is verses 62 through 66.
The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard.
This was an important paragraph to add into the story because when Grandpa Rudy told the story around the campfire, of course, Jordan would ask him, "But Grandpa Rudy, how do we know they didn't steal the body?" And what did Grandpa Rudy say? "Oh, I have a story for that too." Right? The people said to Pilate, "This deceiver said he was going to rise again in 3 days, so you need to make sure that someone is guarding that tomb just so that no one can come and steal the body." So as a result, we now have a guard guarding the tomb where Jesus is to make sure that no one steals his body. So far so good? End of the story? Not yet. Chapter 28, the shortest chapter in the Gospel of Matthew. Shall we see how this story ends? Janie, we'll start with verses 1 through 10. Jesus has risen.
After the Sabbath at dawn, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you."
Wow. Sorry.
So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me."
Wow. Story's winding down. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Remember, Mary was a popular Jewish name as well. Who were they named after? Moses' sister, Miriam. So these two Marys came to the tomb. There are all sorts of supernaturally things happening, like an earthquake and an angel coming to them. And the angel is telling them that he is risen. I love the story of how the angel scares the soldiers too. The soldiers are there to guard the tomb. And yet we get this image of them like running away in fear. He is risen. Go tell his disciples. Remember, we're not calling them apostles yet. They're not been sent out yet. They're still his students. Go tell his students that he is risen. What's great about this is that Jesus doesn't appear to the religious leaders of his day. He doesn't even appear to his 12 friends. Who does he appear to? Women. It's almost setting up this dynamic of who's going to believe those women? Follow me? The women are saying that Jesus rose from the tomb. What a beautiful thing is that the gospel message was not entrusted to men.
Entrusted to women.
Sorry, guys. It was entrusted to women. Which is why we often refer to Mary Magdalene or Mary Magdala as the apostle to the apostles. Well, what does that mean, to be the apostle to the apostles? She was sent to those who would later be sent. She is the one who ran and told the guys, he is risen. She is the apostle to the apostles. Go, tell my brothers. And then there's this instruction to go up to Galilee. So the story comes almost full circle here. When he began his ministry, where was Jesus in Sunday's gospel? When he began his ministry, he was in the north, in Galilee. He was crucified in the south. But the instruction that the angel gives to Mary Magdalene is, go tell my, or Jesus, the risen Christ says, go tell my brothers, I'll meet them in Galilee. So in this story, where is it going to end, do you think? It's going to end here in Jerusalem with him being raised from the dead. It's going to come full circle. It's going to end in Galilee. Are we ready? We're winding it down. Only 2 sections left. Next is the guards' report. Before we get to Galilee, we want to hear what the guards who ran away had to say. This is verses 11 through 15. What do you got?
While the women were in their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. Then the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan. They gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while you were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day.
Yikes, careful, Matthew, you're showing your anti-Semitic stripes there, right? But this is all to say, in Matthew's time, what we're led to understand that in Matthew's time, there were people who were saying, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. His followers stole his body. This, again, is part of that narrative where Matthew is saying, no, that's not what happened. Instead, I'll tell you what happened. Those guards went to the chief priests and the elders. They created a plan. They paid off the soldiers and said, if anyone asks you, you say, they stole his body. And so why would there be people today, Matthew is saying, why would there be people today who believe that his body was stolen? Because that's what the soldiers were paid to say. If anyone asks, tell them they stole his body. And so now, after several weeks of studying the Gospel of Matthew, we come to the end. Vincent, this is Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 to 20. We refer to this as the Great Commission, where Jesus sends out his apostles.
Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of age.
Wow. Remember Luke, which is what we studied last year? Luke wrote 2 books. So Luke would write one book and then fill in with all sorts of details in the second book, like Jesus sending the Spirit down upon them and then being sent out. Matthew's got one book. At least we don't know of him having any of the books. We just have this one book from Matthew. And it ends with them meeting up in Galilee, at the mountain that Jesus told them to meet at, where some of them worshipped and some of them doubted. And I like that because that's just how we are as people. You know, we have different degrees of believing or not believing. It's the same with those first apostles. Some of them believed and some of them had their doubts. But Jesus said, all authority has been given to me, and so go. This is where they become apostles in the Gospel of Matthew. The risen Jesus is sending them out when they get to Galilee. Go, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Interesting that Matthew, obviously, people were being baptized already at the time of Matthew in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So they were tracing that back to, well, why do we do that? Because Jesus said to do that. Jesus said, go and baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. 2,000 years later, how do we baptize? I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Teach them, and this beautiful line at the very end, I am with you always until the end of the age. I will always be with you. And that's how Matthew ends the story. Jesus is still here on earth after the resurrection. Luke gives the great story afterward of the ascension into heaven. Matthew ends the story with Jesus among us and promising to be among us forever. I love that.
So were there only 11 apostles? Because it says 11 disciples went to Galilee. So where did we get...
Because Judas.
What happened to the 12? Jesus killed himself.
So there were only 11 apostles.
Yeah.
Okay.
Except that Luke, who's going to write volume 2, in Luke's volume 2, he's going to have how it is they choose someone to replace Judas. What was his name? Matthias. Huh.
But that's not in this book.
Not in this book. Matthew doesn't tell us anything about that. Which is why the Acts of the Apostles is important.
But
Luke volume 2.
in other books, doesn't it? I'm getting back into the history of the things in the gospel, where the women go into the tomb, and there's a different story, and then one of the disciples says, "I don't believe it until I see myself."
Right?
You know, but then this one it says they go to Galilee.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is that, wait a minute, I've heard other stories. This is not like the other stories that I've heard. There are other stories, like John's story of doubting Thomas, who Jesus rises, and that night comes to his disciples, and Thomas says, yeah, I don't believe that. Jesus has to come back next week to be able to convince Thomas. So there are other stories.
Because in those stories, it makes you seem like it happened in the same city, not in Galilee.
Exactly. We get that impression. Luke tells us the disciples stayed in Jerusalem, and that's where the Spirit came down on them. 50 days. Jesus ascended on the 40th day. Spirit came down on the 50th day.
So this year, since we're in Matthew, will we still talk about Sunday Pentecost, or no, we just skip that since it's not in the...
Excellent question. So what happens is this is the year of Matthew. Remember, we have a 3-year cycle: the year of Matthew, the year of Mark, the year of Luke. When do we hear John? During the Easter season. So we're going to be turning to the Gospel of John during the Easter season. So for those 7 Sundays of Easter plus Pentecost, we'll be hearing stories from the Gospel of John. Because after Jesus' resurrection, what stories do we have from Matthew? Not a lot. John, we have all sorts of great stories. Jesus appearing to them and saying, cast the net off to the other side. And then they come in for breakfast and he says, Simon, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Feed my sheep. Simon, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. We have all sorts of other stories from John. John spends a lot of time on telling us what it is that happened after Jesus rose from the dead.
John was the last to be written, right?
John was the last canonical gospel to be written, the last one in the Bible. The last of the 4 gospels in the Bible to be written. How was that for our line-by-line study of the entire Gospel of Matthew? That took quite a few weeks. now we can say that we've read the Gospel of Matthew. So now what we're going to do as a church, we are beginning Winter Ordinary Time with this coming Sunday now, January the 22nd. We're going to be in the third Sunday of Ordinary Time, which is really the second Sunday of Ordinary Time, but it's the Sunday of the third week of Ordinary Time. We're just going to be studying the Gospel of Matthew for all of the Sundays through the rest of the year, through November, except during the Easter season. We'll take a break from Matthew during the Easter season.
So before doing these classes, I always thought that the inscription above the crucified Jesus was like real, like he was the King of the Jews. That's why they put it up there. I didn't realize that it was to mock him. Yeah.
Big bullies. I mean, that's the image that we get in this story. Matthew talks about how it is that the Jews were bullies. I hate to even say words like that because that plays into all these anti-Semitic ideas, but that's the story that Matthew is telling.
During coffee, we discussed, that different theories and different attitudes and all that. But I still love the story. I still love it, I was brought up like that, and I don't think I'm going to change just because of little details.
Yeah.
But
There you go.
But I love this story.
Same here.
Jesus.
Same here. So I conclude with a prayer. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, a world without end. Amen. Have a great night.